Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us on the webinar today. It's great to have people joining us from definitely all corners of the province and probably further away than that as well. It's great to have Jeff here, and I'll introduce him more in a moment. But just as we have, people coming in and joining us, we're a little bit before our start time of 11 here, but we just want to make sure we get the full hour to answer all your questions and get through this. Great content on commercial leases for you all. Perfect. Excellent. Well, just before we get started, I just want to point out one thing, and it's at the bottom of your screen. It's the Q&A tab. So during today's webinar, if you have any questions at all, that's a great place to put them if you want them to be really kind of visible. Just check that you're putting the questions to everyone and not just the panelist or the host, and that way people can can kind of understand the questions there as well. So that's at the bottom of your screen. The webinar kind of runs till 12 o'clock here. Hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end, but I'll take questions during as well, just based on time. So remember to put those in the panel there. Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks, Jeff, and thank you to all the entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs throughout the province who are here too. I'd like to first of all start by doing our land acknowledgement and saying that Business Link acknowledges and respects that we're on traditional land, meeting grounds, territories, gathering places, and travelling routes of Treaty 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10, and the home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the lands of those who have come before us, reside here now, and in the future. So yeah, welcome to everyone, I think, now on and joined us. Today, the topic is negotiating commercial leases and renewals. And we're joined by Jeff Grandfield, the Lease Coach. He's a senior consultant with the Lease Coach and co-authored Negotiating Commercial Leases and Renewals for Dummies. And for nearly 20 years, Jeff has been consulting businesses on their new leases, lease renewals, and lease assignments. So no one better to speak to us today. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Pleasure.
Always happy to do events with the Business Link over the years in there, both in person and doing these webinars. It's great to get in front of as many people as I can, and I know there's a ton of good resources Business Link provides, so happy to be a small part of that. So I think I've got to get my screen up sharing first here, and let
Perfect.
me
We
know
can
if
see
there's
it.
any issues with that, but I think I've got it.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So if everyone can see the screen, yeah, happy to be here. I'm going to get into the content here because I know we have a little bit tight of time here, depending on the questions we have. But as Matt noted, I'm going to cover today negotiating commercial leases and renewals for dummies, and more specifically, 13 costly mistakes tenants make negotiating their commercial lease or renewal. And the reason I take this topic, especially in sessions that are an hour or less, is that I've been doing this almost 20 years, co-authored a book on this title. I've done sessions that are 3 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours. I could spend a lot of time just telling tenants all the things they should do. And even in 3 or 6 hours, it's going to be the tip of the iceberg. So I find in these shorter sessions, if I can educate tenants or future tenants on some of the key mistakes to avoid, there's a lot more value in there. So that's where I like to cover these 13 costly mistakes. So just in there quickly while we're getting into it, this is a cartoon that's out of the Dummies book in there. Is there any wiggle room on the eternal soul portion of the lease contract? So obviously that nod at that, what's in the lease is going to govern it. And sometimes these leases are chock full of really nasty or unusual clauses that you really need to be aware of and make educated decisions as a tenant out there, because there's a lot of interesting things, to say the least, over the years that I've come across in lease agreements. So we'll get right into mistake number one. Mistake number one is not allowing enough time. So I'm going to cover both how to approach the timelines for a new lease and also for a lease renewal. Some of the listeners on here or a lot of them are likely early into their business career, maybe getting ready to start. Others of you may have one business open or maybe looking to expand to other locations or dealing with a lease renewal. So I'll try to really show the relevance of both of those scenarios for people joining us today. So not allowing enough time on there. If you're doing a new lease agreement, I recommend giving yourself at least 6 months prior to when you hope or plan to be open for your business in there. And this can vary depending on the type of business you're in. You may need more time. Rarely will you need less than 6 months in there. And that's why I say at least 6 months. By the time you go through the process of finding and identifying a potential location for your business, by the time you go through the lease negotiation process, by the time you go through, if you have to do renovations or constructions, you're doing drawings, plans, permitting, and then your actual construction. For a lot of businesses, 6 months will go by in the blink of an eye. So, and I share this because Murphy's Law really applies when you're opening a business. Anything that can go wrong tends to go wrong. Things always take longer than you expect. You're better off to have more time. You're not sacrificing money, making tough decisions. So having time on your side is really critical. And I'll share an example of this. Was years ago. I was speaking with a colleague of mine at a live seminar, and somebody put up their hand. I think it was during this point or the end of the session, and kind of wanted to share their story. And I share this now years later. I share this often in seminars and speaking with people, but they were a business that was retail. They were going into an enclosed shopping center, so like a mall, West Edmonton Mall, Chinook, that type of center in there. And their business, because they were retail and they relied on a mall, they were a franchise business. Their franchisor had told them, and I don't recall the exact details, but it was something like 40 to 50% of their revenue was generated during the holiday months. So the months leading up to Christmas, October, November, December, or November, December, they knew that. So they had signed their franchise agreement early in the year. They thought they had lots of time. They took their time. They looked around at the different shopping centers, found the one they wanted to go in. All of this stuff took longer. By the time they found the site, all those things I mentioned, and they ended up opening their location on December 22nd of their first year in there, basically losing out a whole season of sales and revenue, where now they had to go through those lean months of January, February, March, April without that surge of capital and revenue from that peak season. And they told us, they said that first year was really difficult, to the point where their business almost didn't survive and make it into that next peak season through there. So that's a really good example of that timeline and how it can impact you based on sales. And for some of you, it may not matter when you open. You may not have a seasonal business, that's retail in there, but some industries have their own seasonal business. If you're a hot tub company or different things like that, you have peaks and valleys throughout the year of when your sales surge. So you want to factor that into your opening dates and make sure you plan backwards from that, so you can say, this is my minimum timeline, here's my map, when do I need to be open by? Building on that, if you're in a lease renewal, this is where some people find it almost confusing when I say, well, if you're dealing with a lease renewal, you've got a location, you've been there 5 years, you've been there 10 years, well, it should be easier, right? I should need less than 6 months. Well, that's not the case. If you've got a lease renewal, we recommend that our clients start that process, start thinking about it at least 12 months in advance. And the reason for that is that you don't want to go into this handing over a renewal on a silver platter for the landlord. You've got to figure out, am I going to stay? Am I going to move? You've got to potentially look at your relocation options. If you are going to move, you've got to go through all those steps again. And you need to know that far enough in advance, because most lease agreements are going to have a lease renewal option clause, if you have one, that says if you intend to stay, you have to give the landlord notice of your intention. And usually that's, I would say most commonly 6 months in advance. But some leases say 3, some say 6, sometimes 9, sometimes 12. So what I'm really saying to clients is that, and tenants out there, is that if your lease says you have to give notice by 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, you should really back off 6 months from that date and start thinking about, am I staying? Am I moving? Am I going to negotiate my renewal? Because you should be negotiating your renewal. If it's a 6-month notice, you should be starting somewhere in that 12-month range so that you can negotiate with your landlord And if this location's not going to work for you for the next 5 years, you can, or that landlord's not going to be reasonable, or you find out that they're going to, boot you out, you can make that decision. Am I going to exercise my option or not? Does this location serve my needs? So you spend that 6 months figuring it out ahead of that deadline, then you make that decision.
I even think, sorry, yeah, Jeff, to jump in there. I mean, we had a similar situation at Business Link. We had a 4,000 square foot office space right in the center of Edmonton. And, our business needs changed. But really thinking about for us, like, it probably is even more than a year we would need, because if the landlord decided, I don't know, it was 10%, that things were going to go up 10%, we would have needed to have budgeted for that, like
Mm-hmm.
in the financial cycle kind of before that. So yeah, it's definitely, it's not a last minute thing to put together. Yeah.
100%. And that's the mistake, right? That if you wait too long, you end up having no choice and it costs you money. It's just that simple. And here's a cartoon that for those during that relating to the timelines in there. So, okay. So getting into mistake number two, letting the landlord's broker represent you, or, really maybe the better topic title for this slide is not understanding the agent or the broker's role in here. I get calls from tenants all the time that don't really understand how the industry works and, who's representing who and how that all works in there. And I'll get calls pretty frequently where somebody will say, well, I reached out to the sign on the property and I talked to that agent in there. And, I kind of, especially for new business owners, I was really leaning on them. I don't know real estate. I was leaning on them for advice. And I said, well, that's where you have to be really careful, because that person that's on the sign, they're not out there to hurt you, but they're also not your trusted advisor, in there. They're a listing agent for that property, for that landlord. They're not, they're obligated to be truthful and honest and stuff with you, but they're not obligated. You're not paying them to be your trusted advisor. And that's a mistake some tenants make, is they go, well, this is the real estate expert. Well, he's not your real estate expert. So you really got to be careful on if that agent saying, well, this is the perfect property for you or perfect location. At the end of the day, real estate professionals are salespeople. They're trying to lease that space. That's how they get paid in there. That's the landlord they work for. So that is one mistake that tenants make, is they put their faith and their trust into the wrong person in there and leaning on them for their advice and guidance. And I had a story from, a few years ago where a tenant shared with me too, on not exactly that example, but he was telling me as he called me and said, I called this property and I talked to the agent, and turns out that space that I was calling on was already leased. Their sign was still up. They hadn't taken it down. And he was telling this story, and he said, the agent told him, he said, well, I can help you find a location. He said, well, sure. That's great. This one didn't work out. Help me find a location. And he said, as he was going through, and the agent was sending him properties and they were going to tour properties. And he said, it took me a little while to realize this, but the agent was only sending him properties that he had the listing for. So the ones with his signs on the property, he wasn't showing him everything. And that's not always going to happen in there. But this tenant said, I realized there was better locations, but he was pushing me towards locations that he had the listing on. And that may be because he wanted to fill those spaces. He may have got a bigger commission as a result of that. Not every agent's going to do that. But that's my big thing that I really try to push here, is that when you're dealing with agents, you really want to understand, what is their role? Who are they working for? How are they being compensated? How does this all work? And make sure you're taking that information and using it properly. So a couple quick slides just showing, again, sometimes tenants will go, why was that agent pushing me to do a 10-year deal versus a 5-year? Why were they trying to push me to take more space? Well, sometimes in addition to their commission, they get, bonuses in there. So a longer term and a bigger space, you can kind of see on this matrix in here, it's just the more space, the longer term, the bigger the incentive for the agent on there. Another one, I'll go through a couple real quick. This one, again, on a certain property, pushing a bigger commission to any agents that bring tenants in there, plus a trip to Vegas in there. So again, even if it's your agent, you can ask these questions, what are you being paid? How are you being compensated? Because sometimes there will be incentives landlords or that listing agent will offer to try to induce people to come to that property, but they're inducing the agent, not necessarily the tenant. They may be offering the tenant incentives too, but this may be something to keep in mind. And the last one, similar thing, a leasing bonus of a BMW for an agent that does a space by a certain date with a certain amount of square footage. for that property. So moving on to mistake number 3 is negotiating on just one location. So this to me is absolutely one of the most important components, in my opinion, for business owners, is that the mistake they make is they often go around and they're opening a new location and they'll do their research and they'll look around and they'll get their heart set on one location, and they'll fall in love with it. They'll disregard everything else they've looked at, and this is it. This is a location that's for my business in there. And that's a mistake for a lot of reasons. One, you're getting emotionally attached to something. If you can't negotiate the best deal at that location, the right rate, whatever it may be, the different terms in the lease agreement, you don't have any leverage, in there. And this brings back to mistake number 1, that if you start a negotiation on one location and you spend several days or weeks or even months trying to pull the deal together and it falls apart and you haven't even considered any other options, now you've burned 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks. You're now behind schedule, compounding your mistakes. But this is a good negotiating tactic too. If you're in a situation where there are multiple locations that can work for your business, you've got the ability to make those landlords earn your tenancy in there. Or I've done this for clients where I'll say, well, my client likes your location, but your rates are, $3 or $4 per square foot more, or that other landlord's offering more tenant allowance or offering more free rent, or they're not expecting a guarantee or whatever it may be. You can use that as leverage, to try to sharpen that deal, or you have it as plan B, that if that other location just isn't providing the terms that you want, well, your second best location, if you've started the dialogue, started discussions, starting negotiations, you're not reverting back to square one if a deal doesn't come together. This mistake on renewals is just as important in there. And to your point, Matt, you're saying if you turns out you have to move and you've got a plan, timing, budgeting, this is where, again, people throw all their eggs in one basket. They assume that the landlord's going to be reasonable on the renewal. They assume they want to keep them. They assume it's all going to come together. Well, making that many assumptions is problematic. And that's where tenants get into trouble, where if a landlord realizes that you've emotionally and financially and time-wise committed to stay there, what incentive do they have to re-earn your tenancy? You should be going out and saying, well, what are other landlords in the market offering now after 5 years or 10 years? Are there better rates? Are there inducements? Are there incentives? Does it make sense for me to move my business in there? You really should be evaluating it. Yes, it's work, but it's going to help you determine if your current location is right for your business and if you're getting the best deal possible.
Yeah, just well, there's one comment. There's a question in there as well, but just back to kind of your mistake too there. The Omar says he got royally screwed by mistake number 2. What if they try and manipulate you and make it seem like it will be cheaper and easier for all parties if you just use the landlord's broker?
Well, and that's a good question, and that's what you've got to watch out for, right? And that comes down to, if somebody is using those words, screwing you or manipulating you or whatever in there, I mean, that's a problem. And that's as I said, not all agents or landlords, work in that way and look to do that. But the sad reality in any industry is there are circumstances that happen. And that's where it comes back to, if you're trying to save money on there and you feel like that's the incentive where I can work with this party and, work with just the landlord's representative and it'll be a better deal, cheaper deal. That's the risk, right there, saying I got royally screwed by doing that. You have to be, and that's exactly why I bring this up in these conversations, is that you have to be really careful. This is a lot of money that you're spending for business owners, whether it's on committing to several years of lease, committing to leasehold improvements. This is one of the most expensive and one of the biggest commitments for business owners. So if you look at this short term and go, I can save a little bit of money, well, penny wise, pound foolish, right? You might have saved a little bit or thought you were, but it might really hurt you in the end. And that's where I really advocate that you've got to have your trusted advisor. If you're going through this, you need to have somebody that can look out for your best interest.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, across the kind of board on things of business, I think we often talk about this. Professional advice is not somewhere to save money. Like there are things that we do, but that perhaps is not somewhere where we just want to, like you say, cut the pennies. And this may come later, but it's a question here. Is it okay to rent directly from the landlord? Can you actually negotiate and also part of that, can you negotiate on the proposed rent?
Yeah, and I'm just changing the screen, but I'll answer that in there. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with going directly to the landlord in there, right? Like some landlords do that. They don't have their agent, their representative, their professional, and that's okay. But some landlords are a lot more savvy and sophisticated than the average tenant because a lot of landlords, that is their business, right? Is owning buildings and leasing it. So you always got to be careful on, do you have a level playing field in there? You're more, you can, there's nothing preventing you from doing that. It still doesn't mean that you shouldn't get some proper advice or guidance or help, through that process in there. Even with if you're dealing directly with the landlord, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have advice or guidance or professional help in there. I would say most tenants are at a disadvantage against a landlord, unless that landlord bought that building last week and that's the only property they own and they have zero experience. If you're a tenant that's never leased in there, you're at a disadvantage, whether you're dealing with a seasoned real estate professional or a seasoned landlord.
Gotcha. Yeah. Thanks.
So mistake number 4, and this is a little bit of a long one in here, telegraphing your intentions, giving buying signals, and negotiating by email. And really this mistake is poor communication or wrong communication in there. So, telegraphing your intentions or buying signals, a lot of people don't even really realize they're doing this and how it can impact their negotiation. And I still remember I had a client, this was quite a few years ago now, but I was meeting them prior to a tour. I was meeting them in person. We were touring spots and I sat down with their CEO or general manager and their office manager and another party of their executive team in there. And we sat in their office and we were talking about, they were looking to relocate, and I can't recall, they needed to get bigger or smaller. They knew they were moving though. They had been in business for a lot of years and they were either growing or downsizing. And I said to them in the meeting, we were planning to meet 3 different property managers or agents for 3 different locations. And I said to them, I said, we're going in there. There's a group of us. Let's kind of keep our comments to ourselves, because there's going to be an agent for the landlord or the property manager or the landlord themselves. Somebody from the other side was going to be in the tours with us. And we got into the first location and we got in there, and it was a pretty good location. It seemed to fit a lot of their needs. And the office manager, within 3 minutes of walking the front door, says, in earshot of everybody, loud enough for everyone that was in the room to hear, and said, wow, this location's great. Look at the reception. Look at all the glass down here. Look at all the natural light. Look at our accounting area can go perfectly there. Our staff room can get, and just gushing about how good location was in there. And, I kind of had to say, quiet down a little bit in there. Like, they don't need to hear if we love the location or not in there, because that's just giving that, property manager, agent, or whatever, or the landlord going back and go, wow, they love this location. They're falling in love with it. We probably don't need to offer them as much. They've already decided they want to lease this location. So telegraphing those intentions, giving buying signals, sometimes it happens just because your excitement level. I've also seen tenants that come in that say a bunch of really positive comments about that because they're nervous and they don't want to come across as, I don't know, rude or anything. And they're just saying all nice things about the property. And that's fine. Whether they're nice or not, you can just be kind of even keel and just take it in, ask questions. You don't need to talk about where your office is going. If it's an office location, well, this is perfect. I'm taking this corner office. That kind of stuff doesn't help your negotiation in there. Same thing on renewals. Sometimes I'll work with a client that hires me to help them negotiate their renewal. And I'll be having my first call and debriefing them. And I'll say, well, tell me what you've done so far. Like, what communication has happened? And they'll go, well, nothing really. The property manager called me and I told them that I intend to renew the lease. I said, well, that's a pretty big buying signal, right? In there. And I say, look, my approach is when I'm working with my client on a renewal, I contact the landlord or the property manager and say, are you interested in keeping my client for another 5 years? It's a big difference between saying I'm staying versus do you want to keep me? It sets the tone on those negotiations. And negotiating by email. So this is one that I think probably a lot of people have done, or text message. There's a time and place in any negotiation to document stuff where things need to be in writing, need to be verified. but negotiating by email can create some issues, in again, personal situations or business situations. Probably some people have done this where the tone or the context gets lost in the email. And I've seen cases where it's got very adversarial because somebody took offense to how that was written and that wasn't the intent in there. So a lot of tenants do this if they're negotiating on their own because they're busy running their business or planning their business or working their job while trying to plan a business, and they're busy. So they spend they can't make those calls and do stuff as much as they should during the day. They're firing out emails at 11:30 at night, trying to get everything done. And that's where things happen. Context gets lost, tone gets lost, and timing. There's cases where one phone conversation can eliminate 7 days of emails going back and forth, to get to the same result. So communication is huge, effective communication, not giving buying signals, not wasting time negotiating by email, not losing that tone context. You can really burn up a lot of time. Just going to grab a drink. I apologize. I'm fighting a cold that I think everybody's fighting this winter. Seems like there's lots of bad
Yeah.
bugs going around.
Yeah, no worries at all. Yeah, well, it's a good opportunity to just take a moment and pause for some questions because obviously some of these things you're likely to come on to, but so feel free, to kind of
Sure.
defer as we go. Just a reminder to folks, there's the webinar chat and then there's the question and answer. If you're writing the questions in the chat, move them over to the question and answer. It's just a much easier way for everyone to be able to see them and not get them lost. But Rishma asks, "Hi Jeff, can you talk more about lease guarantees and what landlords are commonly stipulating these days?"
Yeah, good question. I'll touch on it briefly because it can be a pretty deep conversation. And in fact, I just had this question emailed to me before this webinar from a tenant asking about, how their guarantee is going to come into effect when their business, I think they're planning on maybe closing their business. So this is where guarantees come into play. So real quickly, for those that aren't familiar with what a guarantee is that if you have a business and you formed a corporation to go on your lease, landlords will often want to see a personal guarantee. And the way to look at that is effectively you're co-signing the lease with your corporation, meaning your personal name's going on there, that if your corporation doesn't meet the lease obligations, you personally are responsible for that. So, in short, every landlord, and if I was a landlord, I would want this. They want a personal guarantee. They want more security because a lot of times these corporations are formed, for a new business right before they start the business. There's no value, there's no assets, there's risk for the landlord. So to have a guarantee is not unreasonable, in my opinion. If the landlord is outlaying money for the commission for their agent, they might be giving you some free rent, some tenant allowance, they might be doing some landlord's work, there's costs, and it's not small for the landlord to do a deal. They don't want to do a deal, spend thousands and thousands of dollars, and then collect 1 month worth of rent and you take off. So having that is not unreasonable. Of course, I work for tenants every day. If I can avoid a guarantee altogether, absolutely. But there is a middle ground between this is the common thing that people make mistakes on. It doesn't have to be full guarantee, no guarantee. There's a lot of gray area in between there where you can negotiate limits on the dollar amount, limits on how long that guarantee stays in place. So there's a ton of negotiation that can go into that. So the short answer is, are they common on a new lease? Yes. Are they negotiable? Yes.
Perfect, thank you. And just one kind of going back to the previous mistake for a second. Normally, professionally managed companies do provide their offer of renewal. Is it possible to negotiate with them as well?
Absolutely. If they're providing you an offer to renew in there, that's the mistake the tenants make. A lot of people just sign what's put in front of them. They say, if you want to renew, here's the document, and they sign it. They don't negotiate it. You've handed over your renewal on a silver platter. I've been doing this 20 years, and roughly half of my clients are lease renewal negotiations. If there wasn't something to be negotiated as part of that renewal, I wouldn't be doing that for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tenants over the last, almost 20 years. So are there things to negotiate? Yes. Whether it's the rental rate, whether you're trying to get rid of that personal guarantee you had in place, whether you're trying to add more renewal options, you're trying to solve some of the problems and mistakes and things you overlooked in that initial lease agreement. Absolutely. That's all part of the lease renewal negotiation. So the lease renewal should be a negotiation. It shouldn't be just signing a document.
Perhaps a controversial, but we should all maybe be a bit more Donald. Hey, everything's up for negotiation.
Yes, I mean, yeah, to his credit, he negotiates, right? Everything he does is a negotiation. And I mean, that's the way you should, in a lease, it is a negotiation. On a new lease, on a renewal, landlords expect to have some negotiation. Of course, if they're in a strong leverage position, they might not have to negotiate. But that's part of why we're talking about these mistakes. The more of these you can avoid, you're putting yourself in a better position to have that leverage.
Awesome, thanks.
So mistake number 5, not creating a relationship with a landlord or tenants. So this is really important, I find, on there, and this applies to new leases, lease renewals. I'll share a really quick story on this from years ago, my colleague's story. He was working with a tenant going into a retail strip center, and they toured the property once and looked at it. They toured a few other properties, came back. They liked this property, it was shortlisted. Several weeks had gone by. And between the time of their first tour and second tour, the first tour, there was a building or a unit a couple doors down that was like papered up. It was under construction. By the time they came back, the business had opened. It'd probably been open a few days. After they toured it in there, my colleague went into that business owner and introduced himself and said, look, I'm a consultant. I'm an advisor working with a tenant that's interested in leasing space in the building. Do you mind, how was your experience? How was the landlord? How have you found this? How is the process going? And the tenant said, well, as you're aware, I just opened. I'm pretty busy. I'm, short staffed. I don't really have a lot of time to talk, but here's my lease agreement. He reached under his counter, pulled out his lease agreement, flipped it on the counter and said, take a look. So my colleague, a lot of leases will have a lease summary page, and he could see what he paid in rent, how much he got in allowance, how much free rent he got, all of his key terms summarized right there. Pretty good darn information, to have going into a negotiation. How flexible are they on these things? What have they just offered to another tenant? Great information. You may get that from tenants, you may not, but you can find out, is this a good landlord, poor landlord? Even if a business has been there 10 years, 9 years, maybe they're planning to leave. Talk to other tenants in the property, see what their experience is. Some landlords do a tremendous job of looking after their tenants, looking after their properties. Others don't. See what you can find out from the tenants. Getting to know your landlord. Same thing. If your landlord could be a small landlord that lives 4 blocks away from that plaza you're looking at or office building. They might be located in Toronto or New York or Florida or Vancouver. You want to find out, is this a huge landlord, small landlord? Who are they? What's their reputation? Create that relationship in there. It really helps you negotiate or decide if you even want to go into that property. If you know a little bit about the landlord, about the tenants. On renewals, same thing. If you found out, 3 other tenants may have renewed 6 months prior to yours coming up, did the landlord treat them well? Did they give him inducements to stay? Were they difficult to deal with? Are 4 of your co-tenants leaving? If 4 other tenants are leaving, you might not want to stay in the property. So create those relationships, find out what's happening with the tenants, what's going on. Get to know who your landlord is. Even, creating a relationship through your term with your landlord, to me, is important. It doesn't have to be an adversarial relationship. COVID was a great example of this, especially when that first, whatever it was, I forget all the acronyms now, but that first rental assistance program that came out when COVID hit, that program required the landlord to contribute to that in there. And the landlords that liked those tenants, if you had a good relationship with your landlord, you might be the tenant got to help. If you were the pain in the butt tenant, you might not have got that assistance. So take that time to create the relationship. So mistake number 6 is refusing to walk away from a bad deal in there. And there's 2 points to this. Sometimes, whether it's on a new lease or a renewal, and to your point earlier, Matt, is, if your landlord's coming in and saying, hey, on your renewal, your rent's going up 20%, you might say, well, I can't afford this. I've got to relocate. I've got to move. If you make all these other mistakes and you run out of time and do that, you're now in a position where you can't walk away from a bad deal because you haven't looked at options. You don't have the time. That's where you run into a bad business decision. You can't walk away from a deal that's not right to your business. The second thing is using this as a negotiating tactic. I often do this, where if I've got a property that I know has been on the market for a while and the landlord's kind of stuck and we can't get the deal to close on rates or whatever the term is, I'll often say to my client, look, we're not in a competitive situation. The space has been on the market for a long time. Why don't we step away, see what happens in there? And this has worked tremendously for me over the years, where we walk away from the deal and we say, thanks, Mr. Agent, Mr. Landlord, Miss Agent, Miss Landlord. just doesn't look like it's going to work. And we step away and they come back and they chase us and say, well, what if we give you a little bit more free rent? What if we do this? What if we do this? It can be used strategically too. And it's a mistake not to use that in the right circumstances. So
Perfect.
mistake number, so go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, we are getting lots of questions. We might not get them all answered today, just to kind of manage that expectation with people. But I will try and kind of choose questions that perhaps apply to a broader range of people as we go through. One person asks, one question I had was, once a lease is signed, is there any way out of it? For example, if the lease is 15 years and you're 5 years in.
I mean, generally speaking, no. I mean, there's always going to be leases that might have a right of termination for the tenant, but that's extremely rare. You know, landlords don't want that. It's unlikely you're going to have a proper out in there or an easy out, I'd say, in there. If you, whether it's a 5 or a 10 or 15-year lease, can you just terminate the lease with no repercussions? Probably not. The reality of that is that you know, you might have to seek legal advice and say, what are my legal liabilities here and responsibilities? Do I have personal guarantees? What's my corporate implications? But for tenants that don't want to go down that path, because you're probably not going to be on the good side of that and having an easy out, is that I also work with tenants all the time where things didn't go to plan, and now we're trying to negotiate a settlement. We're trying to early termination, a surrender of the lease agreement. That becomes a negotiation as well. Or if your lease is crafted properly, you've got the ability to sublease or assign the lease to get rid of your financial obligations or ease that financial obligation. So generally speaking, your way out is going to come down to some sort of negotiation or finding a replacement tenant.
Perfect, thanks. And you know, some of these I'm sure you're going to come on to around leasehold improvements and things. So I will, I'll kind of rest those questions there. There's amazing the number of questions that seem to be about negotiation, though. Like there's one here. Is it common to receive free rent for renewals as well? I got 2 months free for the first 2-year lease. Is it fair to ask for that again?
It is. I mean, I mean, every deal is going to be different. And again, on how you approach it, your property, your landlord, your situation. But I literally, in the last 24 hours, just did a renewal for my client that's been there 10 years. We did a 5-year renewal and we got 3 months of free rent, you know, in there. So sometimes we're getting free rent. Sometimes it's my clients need to do a renovation and update. We get tenant allowance on a renewal. So while those inducements are more common on a new original lease agreement in there, they're not uncommon on renewals. But a lot of people don't realize that, and they don't even think to ask that in there. You know, if you don't bring it up, the landlord's probably not going to openly offer you incentives they don't have to.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that kind of leads in nice to mistake number 7, you know, not asking or negotiating for more than you want or you need. So whether it's a new lease or a renewal, you know, in there, that's a mistake tenants make. Like I have business owners that go, well, the rent's not that bad. I can afford that. And they're offering, you know, 4 months of free rent or 2 months of free rent, like that person said. Well, even if it works for you, just because the 2 months is acceptable, why wouldn't you try to get 3 or 4 or 5? Commercial leases are expected to be a negotiation. So if you're not going like a good boxing match, if you're going 1 round, that's a pretty crappy boxing match. You know, it should be going back and forth, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 rounds in there at least to make sure that you're not leaving anything on the table in there. So just because you can afford it or you think that that's reasonable, expect to be a negotiation. That doesn't mean you should ask for 20 months of free rent and hoping to get down, you know, where you're going outrageously high number with the idea that some people take that negotiation strategy where I'll start way out here and I'll meet in the middle somewhere. Sometimes that works against you. You know, if you're not being reasonable in kind of the norms in the industry, that strategy might backfire, but you definitely should be asking for more than you want or need, both on that initial negotiation and on your lease renewal. So picking the wrong lease term or length of lease in there. And this is, you know, this is unique to your business, your industry, your situation. I've got clients that I've negotiated 15-year lease for, 10-year lease, 5-year lease, 1-year lease, 2-year lease. It depends on a few things. You know, if you're a tenant that's you know, an office user that generally has no renovations needed, as long as you've got some offices and some space, you don't have a lot of money incurred in there, you might be able to justify a shorter lease because you're not investing a bunch of your own money into the space. The landlord's not putting in money. You might want the flexibility to grow or expand your business. I can tell you in our business in 20 years, we've moved to offices all over the city and different sizes because our staff has gone up and down, or space needs have changed in there. We wouldn't want to do a 10-year lease in our company, but if you're a restaurant owner or a dentist or somebody that's putting $1 million in, your bank or you personally are going to need a longer term lease. So figure out what works for you, and come renewal, you've got to look at that too. For businesses that are the owner is the business and you can't sell it and you're getting close to retirement, you might not want a 5-year lease. I've done lots of this I had a healthcare professional that was a specialist. He's not going to sell his practice. He is the business. He's in his late 70s now. I've worked with him for the last 5 years, 6 years, maybe more than that. I might have done a 3 or 5-year lease when he was in his younger years, but the last few years, every year I work with him to negotiate a 1 or 2-year lease agreement because he's basically saying, I'm negotiating based on my health and my retirement desire. If I'm still feeling good and I don't want to retire, he did a 2-year lease. Now that he's hitting his late 70s, he's doing 1-year renewals. Doesn't have to be 5-year terms, as much as that's the most common. And one other quick point on this, if you're an industry I touched on that might be cyclical throughout the year on your sales, or you're cyclical to Christmas, doesn't have to be a 5-year lease. You can do a 5-year, 6-month lease, 3-year, 3-month lease. Ideally, if you're a business that the industry goes up and down, like if you're peak sales in the summer, you want to open before summers to hit your stride. But if you are ever moving your business or closing your business, you don't want to close or move going into your peak season. You want to close or move going into your dead season. You don't want to be the hassle of disruption of moving in a peak. And if you're going to close out the business, you might as well go out on a high note. So mistake number 9, overlooking obvious deal points. So this is the point where I could spend 20 minutes talking about every one of these points. And this is where I say we just don't have the time in an hour session. But what I really want to hammer home on this is people often get caught up in going, well, I know I should negotiate on the rent per square foot. Is it $28 and I'm going to get it down to 26 or 25 or whatever. But there's so much more to a lease. We've touched on the tenant allowance, the free rent, the personal guarantee. We've touched on 3 of these points in here. Assignment rights, your ability to transfer your lease and sell your business, your parking and signage rights, huge area of battles because people assume they get signage rights. They assume they get parking rights. What's your permitted use? Do you have any exclusive rights for your use? Is the tenant your corporation? Is it your personal name? So I could list off another 20 points that are not as obvious points in there, but could be absolutely critical to you in your business and your operation today, tomorrow, 5 years, 10 years down the road. So the point I want to hammer home on this is the mistake is just getting focused in on a rental number. Your lease for most of you is going to be anywhere from 20 to, I looked at a lease yesterday that was 116 pages long for my client. So there's a lot more terms than just rent when you're dealing with whether it's 20 pages or a 116-page lease agreement. Some of those can be pretty darn material to your business. It's another cartoon there. What do you mean our ground lease is up? So mistake number 10 is making the first offer or letter of intent. So I always, when I'm negotiating for my clients on a new location, I try to get the landlord or the landlord's agent to say, again, psychologically, hey, we're interested in your space. Are you interested in us? Can you give us a proposal outlining your expectations? If you can get them in writing or even verbally to say, well, we're expecting $28 a square foot. We want a 5-year term. And if you do a 5-year term, we'll throw in a couple months of free rent and we'll give you a $10 allowance. If you can get that in writing, ideally, well, now you know where the starting point is. If you just look at a location and you go, yeah, I'm just going to fire an offer in, you have no idea where the true benchmark was. Where were you starting from? So I always try to get as much information, whether it's verbally or ideally in a written formal proposal that my client could sign, outlining their expectations. To me, that's the foundation of where we're negotiating from, where we're going to counter from, and really measure the progress that we're making on there. And on a lease renewal, I touched on this earlier, how I approach landlords or property managers. I never come in and say, I want to stay and here's what I'm willing to offer. What I said before is I come in and say, are you interested in keeping them? If you are, can you send us your standard renewal proposal? one of the commenters said, I've got a renewal proposal on a renewal, may not have had tenant allowance or free rent, but at least you've got that starting point. You've got them to come out and say, we want to keep you, and here's what our expectations are. That's what you're trying to do. Get them to make the first offer, whether it's a new lease or a lease renewal. Try to stay on track here because I know we've got a lot of questions, but mistake number 11 is looking too successful. So again, buying signals. If you're a new tenant in there and you're saying coming in, and this kind of does relate to the buying signals, but saying, oh, the rent's only $20 a square foot. Oh, it's no problem. Way under, budget in there. This is my third location. We're killing it at our other two. This is peanuts. We can pay this. Sometimes people say that because they want to show that they're a bona fide good tenant. Sometimes they want to, they have pride in their success. There's nothing wrong with that, but right time, show your pride at the right time in there, and you don't have to share that information. Same thing on renewals. I've had clients that when I ask them that question, what have you shared with your property manager? Oh, well, I told my property manager I want to stay. We're a franchise system. I was telling them like how good this property's been to us, how good our location is. We're number 4 on our franchise sales out of 200 units in the franchise system. That's great if you are, but sharing that with your landlord, your property manager, the agent, maybe information you don't need to share. Not going to help you. So mistake number 12, not doing your homework, not taking negotiations seriously. I'm preaching to the choir here. All of you that are on this call, this is part of it, but this is the tip of the iceberg. There's a wealth of information out there, on the internet. Again, take it with a grain of salt on accuracy on what you're getting on the information that's out there, but that's doing your homework. Tremendous amount of information you can find on the internet. Looking at multiple locations is doing your homework. Talking to other tenants is doing your homework. Talking to the landlords, doing your homework. Do your research. Take the negotiations seriously in there. I guarantee you that the vast majority, if not all, landlords are. This is their business in there. They're trying to maximize their revenue. This is a serious business for them, and you can't take it lightly too. I think the challenge for tenants is that leasing a space is a means to an end. No tenant really goes, I want to lease space. They say, I want to open my business. I want to open my restaurant. I want to open my daycare. I want to open my coffee shop, whatever that may be. Leasing isn't their desire, their plan, their expertise. So you've got to really dig into this and be prepared because it will be a battle. It will be a fight. It will be a negotiation.
Yeah, and it's just such a significant cost, isn't it? For all, like it's either their biggest or second biggest cost, where it depends on the nature of the business. For most businesses, it is.
It
Yeah.
truly is. Yeah. And that's where, it kind of leads into this point we've touched on is the last mistake is not getting professional help. And that's, depending on your business and your scope of business, it may mean a team, and I say this, I was just working with a daycare here this week, and I was talking to them. I said, do you have your team? You've got me on board. I'm one of your people that's helping on the real estate side, but I said, do you have, your architects and your designers and your contractors and, all these different people that are going to be critical through the process in there. So whether it's, contractors, designers, architects, engineers, lawyers, accountants, consultants, real estate professionals, you've got to have your team, and you've got to find not everyone's going to need all those pieces for their team, but you're going to need professional help, in there, in my opinion. And that's, I had this question from a kind of business consultant and advisor that was recommending a client work with me. And he said, I could talk to them about your services. They weren't sure if they're going to could budget the fees in there. And I said, that's okay if they don't want to work with me. But I said, if they can't afford to spend money on this critical component of their business, they're probably undercapitalized in there. If they don't have the money to get professional help, they're going to run into problems. And it might not be the real estate side of things. It might be on the construction side of things. Like construction's one that I can see people in their head will go, well, I thought this was going to cost me $50,000 to build. Turns out to be $170,000. Well, if they had the right team in there, they might have been able to be realistic or shave costs or do that kind of stuff. So I know we're running tight to the time, so I'll get it right to this slide here for the Q&A, and we can dive into, I know we've got a ton of questions, I think. So Matt, if you want to cherry pick the ones that you think are most relevant. And then I will put up my contact information at the end here. I think it is available. But if we don't get to your question today, email me. I'm more than happy to spend, 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes with you on the phone, talking about your situation, answering your question, because I know we're not going to get to them all today.
Jeff, and we definitely appreciate that. Like we know that yeah, you're a busy professional and you're in demand, but to offer that to clients, like that's so good. Like we really appreciate that. Yeah, there are lots of questions. That last slide is just so right though. The one before that, across your business, like you kind of touched on it. Oftentimes we just want to get started, don't we? We've got this great business idea and we want to get started, but I often, people will come to Business Link and, should I set up as a corporation or should I set up as a sole proprietor or, tell me. And it always comes back to, like you need to get that professional advice. Like we'll point you in the right direction. We can give you some education on it. And if you don't have at that moment, that if you don't have the funds to be able to get that professional advice, perhaps you're 5 years off or 3 years off, or, like yeah, you have to don't save money on getting good advice.
Yeah.
We've got lots of questions. We'll do some kind of quick fire ones, and then there's one topic that comes up again and again. So some quick fire ones. Any specific advice on leases for non-profit businesses? Anything big different that we would need to think about there?
Um, the, I mean, from a landlord perspective, some landlords are, want to work with nonprofits out of the, goodness of their heart, and you might be able to get some benefits in there. You do if you're properly registered. Again, a little bit out of my scope of expertise, but you will be tax exempt on, stuff on what's charged back in the lease. And sometimes I see that not properly handled, where the landlord will still charge back like taxes and stuff on there that they are exempt from. So that's one thing to look at as far as, any exemptions in there. But I think it is something that's relevant to, the landlord understanding your business, any business. I think it's good for the landlord to understand what you do and who you are, because some landlords will have a place to help nonprofits because maybe that nonprofit is something that's important to them, in there. So I think it's important to bring it up. And when you're a nonprofit, share that, what you're doing, what your values are, what your benefits to whatever group you're serving in there, because that may help you get a little bit better of a deal to help ensure that you stay in business because the landlord sees value to that.
Yeah, and that's for something like from Business Link's perspective, we would have a leasing agreement in line with our funding agreements with government. Like we're funded on cycles, so kind of to Jeff's point before, if a 3-year funding agreement might not work with us, we would need it to end March 31st of the financial year, just because we wouldn't
Exactly.
want those afterwards.
Yep,
Um,
exactly. Because you're going off funding. Yep, for sure. Good point.
Yeah, what there's questions relating to daycare. Any special considerations for a daycare business?
Daycare, yes, daycare is a bit complex and difficult. It's in high demand, so it can be competitive. You have to be prepared to be patient with daycares. And the timing. One thing you got to be really careful of is your budgeting and your timing, because there's a big expense if you're having to renovate. Daycares have a lot of requirements for your development permits, building permits with the city for safety, for obvious reasons in there. There can be a lot of costs that people don't assume are going to fall on them, whether it's adding fire alarm systems, to meet all the code requirements based on your capacity. There is a lot going on with daycares in there. So you really got to know that. The nice thing is the province does help you a little bit, in there, through your licensing part as far as what you need, but you're dealing with the different municipalities and cities on code requirements. And the timing is the problem on this. A lot of people will negotiate the lease without really understanding all this, and then end up opening 7 months after they're paying rent because there's delays on their getting their development permit, their building permit, going through their provincial licensing process. So there is a lot of, when I talked about like what's your target date and what steps you need to get there, you really need to map that out. You really need to be working with construction people that understand daycares. Sometimes a contractor will come out and go, hey, yeah, you just need this. And then all of a sudden you're into it with the city, and then you realize you need a fire alarm system, and you need, ground surveys of the, engineered surveys where your playground area is going outside and all these different things. It is very complex. So I strongly recommend you have a real estate professional that's dealt with daycares, and that your construction team is familiar with it, because you'll blow your timing and budget pretty quick on a daycare.
Yeah, and yeah, the timing, like you're right. You don't want to open in October when everyone's found their
Yeah.
sort of, their needs for September. Um, okay, we got lots of questions. There's lots around leasehold and leasehold improvements. Like that is coming up. Like what's the advice when negotiating that? Like, is it something separate? Do we do it as part of the lease? Like, there's
It
just lots.
should be, yeah, it should be part of the lease in there. Like everything, like when you're negotiating a lease, you want to negotiate it collectively, like not, piecemeal where you negotiate the rent, then the allowance, and then your exclusive rights, your use rights, all of that should be part of the initial offer or proposal. So that 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 page agreement, as opposed to that 20 or 100 page, those a leasehold improvement allowance or tenant allowance would be considered a core business term. It's a financial term. It's a really important part. You should negotiate it early. That's when you have the leverage. If you've already got the deal pretty much done and you try to come back in, you kind of miss the boat on it. So, yeah, it should be done collectively with the other core business terms. And the question I often get in there, and this, I don't know, I'm not looking at the written questions in here, but it might be, I often get the question, what's an average tenant allowance? What's a reasonable tenant allowance? But that varies so much depending on your length of term in the lease, the rent you're paying, the free rent. Like, in other words, that's why I say collectively it has to be negotiated, because so many different factors are going to influence what that allowance is.
Perfect, thank you. Um, Kendria asks, and this is for lots of small businesses, any advice for viewing and negotiating lease for a room rental or a common space in like a spa setting, something like that? Is it kind of different entirely or lots in common?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, if you're like, and I think using the spa setting, or let's use the spa setting in there, where you
Yes.
might say, I'm a massage therapist and I want to rent a room inside this spa or this physiotherapy clinic. Generally, if you're actually renting the room and that's your exclusive area, it's going to be a sublease in there. And you might have, in some of these deals, and this may be going to it, you might lease let's just use the massage room in there, but you have access to the staff room, in conjunction with the other business or common areas, and things like that. So it is different if that's the approach that you're dealing with that lease as a subtenant, and your landlord is actually the main tenant in the building in there. So the process is still generally the same, but you've got to go through extra hoops, because generally any sublease is going to have to be approved by the actual landlord, in there. But it's the same approach and same concerns you take. And same thing with if you're in the, shared spaces in there where you're renting a portion of that, and you've got a common meeting room areas and all that kind of stuff. Those, like Business Link, I think, uses in there, you shared with there. They are still the same approach, but there can be layers of complexity when you're dealing with shared spaces and your right to use it. Is it so many hours? Is it certain hours of the day? Is it certain times? All those kinds of things, whether it's a sublease, when there's shared space or a portion, there can be little wrinkles that you've got to think about to avoid conflicts.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that Laurie asked a kind of similar question, and you kind of addressed that there around, can there be kind of hidden costs in that negotiation when we're talking about common space? And I suppose it's just a case of, yeah, really getting clarity and having that written clearly.
100% clear document where it clearly spells out who's responsible for what, big time.
Yeah, and then a couple of kind of questions. ZB asks, basically, is it a leaser's market or a leasor's market right now? Like, are we in good positions to negotiate, or is it different from the housing
I
market?
mean, it depends. I know we've got listeners from all over, everywhere in the province. So, like, where you are, are you in the smaller community, bigger community? Are you, even you look at, coming out of COVID still, like a downtown office tenant versus a suburban retail tenant, completely different, situation. Um, there's a lot different leverage in there. And you look at back when oil crashed and recessions, and especially downtown Calgary, for example, where they're giving away office space. If you're willing to pay the operating expenses in there, you could pay zero rent. You could get a deal where you are just paying the operating expenses in there, whether it's directly with the landlord or the tenant. And I would say, generally speaking, it's still, there's opportunity for tenants to negotiate for sure. Suburban retail stuff costs have gone up, in there, construction costs have gone up. There's been less construction because of that. It's kind of pushed retail rates up where even existing older retail rates are going up because people are going, well, there's no new stuff or it's so expensive. I'm going to go to this older building because it's way cheaper. But now that's pushing rents up in there. Whereas downtowns, in the bigger centers, there's still pretty good opportunities to negotiate very favorable deals. And it's hard to really, we're in a market where sometimes it's been where it's like, this is clearly a landlord market across the board. This is clearly a tenant. I think it really does depend, the building you're in, whether it's retail, whether it's office, big city, smaller centers, office, it's all over the map. But the point being is that you're not in a position in most deals where you're bidding up it. Is there opportunity to negotiate for tenants if you take the right approach? Yes.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. Oh, I am going to take one or two more questions just because there are so many. One, actually, I've got one to end on as well. When you're negotiating a lease for a new business, I'm going to answer this one. How do you know what licenses or permits you need? So I know that Jeff and the lease coach and there'll be various advice, but also Business Link can absolutely help on that because there's times when the permits that you require are not necessarily tied to the business location as such, or the leased building as such. So there are things definitely to kind of consider there. So definitely reaching out to Business Link is a starting point. And then this one is definitely for you. Jeff, thank you so much for this. Wish I attended this before I signed my own lease. Do you have a Calgary twin contact that one can contact for consultation? But I suppose it's a general one. So, Jeff, are you across the province or how does that go?
Yeah, I am. So, I mean, I spent a lot of time in Calgary. I physically live in Edmonton. I'm assuming they figured it out from maybe I'm either Red Deer or Edmonton based off the area code on there. But I do live in Edmonton, but I've got as many clients in Calgary as I do Edmonton. I was just down there a couple of weeks ago. I was down there about a month ago doing a session like this live in Airdrie. So yes, I talk to clients all over Western Canada for that matter. So if you want to talk to me about your leasing matters, doesn't matter if you're Calgary, Edmonton, Fort McMurray, Medicine Hat, wherever you are, I'm available to chat with you.
Perfect, exactly. You just charge double if they're in Vancouver, hey?
Depends. Yeah, depends what hockey team they cheer for.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Well, Jeff, thank you so much. It really has been such a valuable. I love presenting these because I feel I learned so much as well, and I know there are lots of questions. So hopefully people will join out, and we'll have to set another one of these in a few months' time as well because it's just been so valuable today. We've had over 100 people here, and it's great to get this information out. So thanks for attending. Thank you very much, Jeff. We will be sending out a recording after the webinar, and so you'll get an email. But also, it's really, really important to us to get feedback on what you've seen today. Like it's valuable for us as an organization to learn about the type of programming that you want to see. So please, so we can continue to keep these free and available to you, please provide that feedback. Thanks again, Jeff.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks now. Bye, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.